You really thought a stray like you could ever sit at the head of a table like this? Look at you!
You really thought a stray like you could ever sit at the head of a table like this? Look at you. This is exactly where your kind belongs, face down, eating our scraps. The words rang out across the grand ballroom, amplified by the sudden, suffocating silence of 300 affluent guests. The vanilla buttercream was freezing against Maya's skin, sliding in heavy, humiliating clumps down the bridge of her nose, pooling at the collar of her simple, unbranded black dress. The sugar stung her left eye. The room smelled of expensive Tom Ford cologne, roasted duck, and the sharp, metallic tang of pure malice. Maya did not gasp. She did not cry. She did not raise her hands to wipe the frosting from her face. She simply stood there, breathing in slow, measured counts of 4, her posture as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. The profound stillness of her body created a vacuum in the room, a tension so thick it made the surrounding billionaires shift uncomfortably in their bespoke suits. "Call security," her husband Julian sneered, wiping a smudge of icing from his Rolex. "Get this pathetic creature out of my house before I have her arrested for trespassing." He smiled, a cruel, triumphant curving of his lips, certain he had just destroyed her. He was certain he had finally put her in her place, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his Italian leather shoes was already crumbling. He was entirely unaware that the very foundation of his life, his wealth, and his arrogant existence was about to be systematically erased. But to understand how Julian Vanderbilt signed his own financial and social death warrant in front of 300 cameras, you need to go back. You need to understand exactly who he thought he married, and who Maya actually was. The morning of the Vanderbilt Centennial Gala began like every other morning for Maya, in absolute, deliberate quiet. At 4:30 a.m., long before the sprawling 30-acre Sterling Manor estate woke up to the sounds of landscapers and private chefs, Maya was already in the greenhouse. She wore a faded yellow rain jacket, the cuffs frayed from years of use, and a pair of scuffed, second-hand gardening boots that Julian despised. Her hands, deep in the damp, nutrient-rich soil of the orchid beds, were calloused and cracked. They did not look like the hands of a society wife. They looked like the hands of a woman who worked for a living, which was exactly how Julian's family saw her, as the charity case Julian had picked up from a working-class neighborhood in Chicago to rebel against his aristocratic parents. The greenhouse smelled of wet earth, blooming jasmine, and the bitter, comforting aroma of the black coffee she brewed in a chipped ceramic mug she had owned since she was 19. This was her daily ritual. This was the quiet space where she remembered who she was before she put on the armor required to survive the Vanderbilt family. As she carefully pruned a dying leaf from a rare ghost orchid, she hummed a low tune her mother, Eleanor, used to sing. Eleanor had been a woman of profound, quiet strength. She had worked 3 jobs, her body breaking down under the weight of systemic exhaustion. Yet she never allowed the world to bow her head. Before Eleanor passed away, she had given Maya a single piece of wisdom that became the thematic spine of Maya's entire existence. "Dignity isn't a coat you wear for other people, Maya," Eleanor had said, her rough hands clasping Maya's face. "It's the spine that holds you upright when they try to strip you bare. They can take your money, they can take your time, but they can only take your dignity if you hand it to them." Maya wore a simple silver pendant around her neck, tucked beneath her shirt, a physical manifestation of that promise. Julian, meanwhile, was a man who mistook surface for substance. He was the heir apparent to the Vanderbilt Hayes conglomerate, a man who measured human worth in carats, zip codes, and bloodlines. He walked into the greenhouse at 7 a.m., dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit that cost more than most families made in a year. His Patek Philippe watch caught the morning light, a heavy, ostentatious declaration of his perceived superiority. "Are you really going to wear those disgusting boots in the house again?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with casual disdain. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the dirt under her fingernails. My mother is hosting the board of directors this afternoon. The last thing she needs is her daughter-in-law looking like the help. Maya calmly wiped her hands on a towel. I'll use the service entrance, Julian. See that you do, he scoffed. And please, try to look presentable tonight. You're representing me. I don't need my colleagues wondering why I didn't just hire you to scrub the floors. This was the dynamic. For 3 years, Julian had engaged in a campaign of psychological attrition. He had pursued her initially because her quiet confidence fascinated him, a stark contrast to the sycophantic women in his circle. But once they married, his fascination morphed into resentment. He hated that he couldn't control her internal peace. He hated that she didn't worship his wealth. And most of all, the Vanderbilt family hated her race. They never used slurs in public. Their racism was refined, weaponized through policy, exclusion, and microaggressions. It was the way the waitstaff at their country club would overlook Maya to pour water for a white guest. It was the way Julian's mother would introduce Maya as Julian's urban project. But Maya never begged for their approval. She never shouted back. She remained observant, quiet, and meticulously documentarian. Every slight, every financial irregularity she noticed in Julian's home office, every whispered conversation she overheard in the sprawling, white-coated halls of Sterling Manor. She noted it all in a small, leather-bound notebook she kept locked in her desk. What Julian and his family did not know, what they could not possibly have fathomed in their blinding arrogance, was the truth of Maya's bloodline. Maya was not a stray from the South Side. She was the sole surviving granddaughter of Marcus Sterling, a Black industrialist who had built an empire in the shadow of the Jim Crow era. Blocked from traditional banking, Marcus had built a shadow economy, investing in real estate, supply chains, and technology through shell corporations. By the time he died, his clandestine wealth had ballooned into a holding company known only as the Vanguard Trust, a $1 trillion leviathan that secretly owned the debt of half the aristocratic families on the Eastern Seaboard, including the Vanderbilts. Maya owned the estate Julian slept in. She owned the company Julian pretended to run. She was, quite literally, the architect of his reality. But her grandfather's will stipulated she must live without the Vanguard name until her 30th birthday, to ensure she understood the value of the soil before she inherited the earth. Her 30th birthday was tonight. The Sterling Manor Grand Ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceilings, casting a harsh, glittering light over the 300 guests. The air was thick with the scent of Chanel No. 5, expensive bourbon, and the underlying rot of unearned entitlement. Waiters in pristine white jackets floated through the crowd, carrying trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. Maya descended the sweeping mahogany staircase at precisely 8 p.m. She wore an unbranded, floor-length black gown. It was elegant but possessed none of the flashy, diamond-encrusted vulgarity favored by the Vanderbilt women. As she entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop. The subtle, systemic exclusion began immediately. Julian's mother, Eleanor Vanderbilt, caught sight of her and audibly sighed, turning her back to form a physical wall of silk and pearls with her friends. A tech billionaire from Silicon Valley looked Maya up and down, smirked, and whispered something into his wife's ear that made her laugh into her champagne flute. Julian was at the center of the room, holding court near a massive 5-tier artisanal cake commissioned for the company's centennial. He was 3 glasses of bourbon deep, his face flushed, his ego inflated by the sycophants surrounding him. When he saw Maya, his eyes hardened. He saw a Black woman standing quietly in a space he believed belonged exclusively to him and his kind. It triggered a deep, fragile rage within him. "Ah, the charity case has arrived," Julian announced loudly, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of a string quartet. The room grew quiet. 300 pairs of eyes shifted to Maya. Maya stopped walking. She stood near the edge of the dance floor, her hands relaxed at her sides. "Good evening, Julian," she said, her voice even, devoid of any tremble. "Don't good evening me," Julian snapped, stepping away from his friends. The bourbon sloshed in his crystal glass. He was escalating, performing for his audience. "You know, my colleagues were just asking me how we manage our philanthropic efforts. I told them I do my part at home. I take in the destitute." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Bystanders, CEOs, politicians, socialites, smiled in complicity. A young hedge fund manager pulled out his phone, the red recording light blinking as he pointed it at Maya. No one stepped forward. No one intervened. Their silence was a violent endorsement of Julian's cruelty. Julian closed the distance between them, his face inches from hers. She could smell the sharp alcohol on his breath, the mint of his toothpaste. "You don't belong here," he whispered, though the microphone clipped to his lapel for his upcoming speech caught the audio, broadcasting it faintly through the room's speakers. "You're a parasite. You wear my clothes, you eat my food, you sleep in a house your ancestors couldn't have even built the bricks for." The racism was no longer subtextual. It was explicit, public, and recorded. Maya looked into his eyes. Her heart rate remained steady. She observed the vein pulsing on the side of his neck. She observed the absolute certainty of his supremacy. "The soil remembers who tends it," she thought. "Julian," Maya said softly, "you are making a mistake that you will not be able to undo." "The only mistake I made was letting you through the front door," he shouted, his rage boiling over. He grabbed her by the shoulder, spinning her around toward the towering centennial cake. With a sudden, vicious shove, he pushed her forward. Maya lost her footing on the polished marble. She braced herself, but the momentum carried her face first into the lowest tier of the cake. The impact was soft, but the humiliation was a physical weight. The heavy, cold vanilla buttercream smashed against her skin. The structural dowels of the cake scraped her cheek. The entire 5-tier monstrosity wobbled, threatening to collapse. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom, followed instantly by a sickening, synchronized burst of laughter. The camera phones multiplied. Flashes went off. Maya slowly pushed herself back to a standing position. She did not wipe her face. The icing clung to her eyelashes, dripping onto her black dress. She stood perfectly still, the picture of absolute, unshakable composure. This non-reaction unsettled the room. She wasn't giving them the hysterical breakdown they craved. She was a mirror, reflecting their ugliness back at them. "Look at her," Julian mocked, raising his glass. "This is exactly where your kind belongs, face down, eating our scraps." From the periphery of the room, a single figure moved against the tide of mockery. It was Sergeant Thomas Vance, the head of the estate's private security detail, a black man who had served 20 years in the military and had watched Julian's abuse for months with growing disgust. Thomas stepped between Julian and Maya, his broad shoulders shielding her from the camera flashes. He pulled a clean, white cloth from a waiter's tray and offered it to her. "Ma'am," Thomas said, his voice thick with quiet respect. "Let me help you." Julian's face contorted in fury at the insubordination. "Vance, step away from her or you're fired on the spot. In fact, do your job. Call the police. Have this woman escorted off my property for trespassing and destruction of property. She's ruined the centennial." Maya took the cloth from Thomas, but did not wipe her face. Instead, she reached into the small clutch purse she had dropped on the floor. She pulled out her phone. The screen was already glowing with a text thread to a contact named simply Director. Maya typed 3 words. "It is time." At precisely 8:14 p.m., as the distant wail of police sirens began to echo down the long, winding driveway of Sterling Manor, Maya looked at Julian. "You called the police," Maya stated, a factual observation, not a question. I'm having you removed like the trash you are, Julian spat. You have nothing. You are nothing. When they drag you out of here, you will walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Dirt. Maya simply nodded. Her internal armor was flawless. She had the documents, she had the recordings, she had the legal authority. She looked at the bystanders, the laughing hedge fund manager, the sneering mother-in-law, the complicit elite. She cataloged every face. The heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a deafening crash. The police had arrived. But they were not alone. The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers strobed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting fractured, chaotic shadows across the crystal chandeliers and the horrified faces of the guests. 4 uniformed officers entered the room, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. But it was the men who walked in ahead of the police who brought the oxygen in the room to a complete, suffocating standstill. There were 6 of them, dressed in immaculately tailored charcoal suits, moving with the synchronized precision of apex predators. At their center was Arthur Pendleton III, the fearsome, notoriously reclusive managing director of the Vanguard Trust. Pendleton was a legend in financial circles, a man whose mere signature could bankrupt nations. Julian's sneer faltered. His mother, Eleanor Vanderbilt, dropped her champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. "Mr. Pendleton?" Julian stammered, stepping away from Maya, his arrogant posture instantly dissolving into fawning subservience. We didn't expect you. The Vanguard Trust rarely sends representatives to our events. Please, forgive the disturbance. We were just having a trespasser removed." Julian gestured dismissively toward Maya, who still stood quietly beside Sergeant Vance, the buttercream slowly drying on her cheek. Arthur Pendleton did not look at Julian. He did not acknowledge the Vanderbilt family at all. Instead, he walked past the billionaires, past the trembling socialites, and stopped directly in front of Maya. With slow, deliberate respect, Arthur Pendleton III, a man who did not bow to presidents, lowered his head. "Happy 30th birthday, Madam Chairman," Pendleton said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. The transitional legal filings were executed at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You are now the sole signatory of the Vanguard Trust. We are at your absolute disposal. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer just quiet. It was a physical pressure, heavy and absolute. The clinking of glasses ceased. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of Julian Vanderbilt. What is he talking about?" Julian whispered, his skin turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to lean heavily against the catering table to stay upright. "Madam Chairman, she's nobody. She's a stray." Pendleton slowly turned his head to look at Julian, his expression one of profound, clinical disgust. "You are speaking to Maya Sterling," Pendleton announced to the room, his voice amplifying the devastation. "Sole heir to the Sterling estate. The Vanguard Trust owns 84% of the leveraged debt of the Vanderbilt Hayes conglomerate. She is not a guest in this house, Mr. Vanderbilt. She owns the holding company that owns the bank that holds the deed to this property. She owns the clothes on your back. She owns the ground beneath your feet." The color completely drained from Julian's face. The physical deterioration was instantaneous. He looked as though he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. The sycophants who had been laughing moments before physically backed away from him, retreating into the shadows, desperate to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Maya finally lifted the clean white cloth and slowly, deliberately, wiped the icing from her face. She revealed her pristine, unbothered features. She handed the soiled cloth to Julian's mother, who took it with a trembling, terrified hand. Maya took one step toward Julian. She did not raise her voice. She did not shout. She spoke with a calm, devastating moral authority that commanded the attention of every soul in the room. "You walked into my house, Julian," Maya began, her voice slicing through the dead air. "You drank my bourbon. You funded your extravagant, hollow life with my family's capital. And when you saw a Black woman standing in a space you believed was exclusively yours, the first thing you did was try to publicly humiliate her. You assumed my silence was weakness. You assumed my patience was submission." Julian opened his mouth, a pathetic, high-pitched stammer escaping his throat. "Maya, sweetheart, this is a misunderstanding. It was a joke. The pressure of the centennial." "I didn't steal from your company," Maya continued, ignoring his pathetic attempt to reframe his abuse. Her eyes locked onto his, cold and immovable. "You embezzled $4 million from the philanthropic fund to cover your gambling debts. I didn't lie about my heritage. You built your entire identity on a mountain of fraudulent leverage. You called the police to remove a trespasser." Maya turned to the lead police officer, who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Officer," Maya said, her voice steady, "I am the lawful owner of Sterling Manor. The deed is being transmitted to your precinct captain as we speak. I would like Julian Vanderbilt and anyone who does not reside in this home escorted off my property immediately. Furthermore, Mr. Pendleton has the documentation regarding Mr. Vanderbilt's embezzlement, which constitutes felony wire fraud." Pendleton silently handed a thick, leather-bound dossier to the lead officer. You can't do this," Julian screamed, panic finally shattering his facade. He looked wildly around the room at his friends, his colleagues, his mother. "Do something, she's taking everything." But the enablers did what enablers always do when the power dynamic shifts. They abandoned him. The hedge fund manager who had been recording slipped his phone into his pocket and looked at the ceiling. The billionaires looked at their shoes. "You are right about one thing, Julian," Maya said, delivering the final, fatal blow. "I am sending you away with exactly what you brought to me. Dirt." The police moved in. The click of the steel handcuffs locking around Julian's wrists was sharp and final. As they marched him toward the grand double doors, he was weeping, a loud, ugly, pathetic sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. His mother trailed behind him, weeping hysterically, clutching the soiled towel Maya had handed her. The reckoning was absolute and quantified. Within 72 hours, the Vanderbilt Hayes conglomerate was formally dissolved, its assets liquidated to cover $400 million in leveraged debt. The Vanderbilt family was evicted from all Vanguard-owned properties. Julian's recorded use of racial slurs and physical assault, captured on 36 smartphones, made national news, rendering him utterly unemployable. He was sentenced to 36 months in federal prison for the wire fraud Maya had meticulously documented in her leather notebook. The institutional rot was excavated. The country club that had ignored Maya was bought out and transformed into a community horticultural center. The philanthropic fund Julian had drained was fully restored and renamed the Eleanor Sterling Foundation, offering full-ride agricultural and engineering scholarships to inner-city students. 6 months later, the golden afternoon light filtered through the glass of the Sterling Manor greenhouse. Maya knelt in the damp earth, wearing her frayed yellow rain jacket and scuffed boots. Beside her was a 12-year-old girl named Chloe, the first recipient of the Eleanor Sterling Foundation scholarship. Maya was teaching her how to repot a ghost orchid. "Do I have to wear gloves?" Chloe asked, looking at the rich, dark soil. Maya smiled, her hands bare, covered in the earth. She touched the silver pendant around her neck. "No," Maya said softly. "The soil remembers who tends it, not who buys it. Let your hands get dirty. It's how you know the ground is real. She breathed in the smell of blooming jasmine and wet earth, surrounded by silence, completely at peace. The armor was off. She was finally home. A woman was publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and racially degraded because an arrogant man mistook her humility for weakness. But what really made this story matter wasn't the $1 trillion twist. It was the unbreakable, quiet dignity of a woman who knew her worth long before the world was forced to acknowledge it. How many times have you walked into a room where people assumed you didn't belong, simply because of how you looked, where you came from, or how quiet you were? If you know someone who is currently fighting a silent battle against people who underestimate them, someone who needs to be reminded that their quiet strength is actually their greatest weapon, share this story with them right now. Subscribe to this channel as we continue our series on everyday justice, exposing the systems that try to break us and celebrating the unbreakable human spirit. Because dignity doesn't need a bank account to be valid. It doesn't need the applause of a crowded room. It just needs a spine strong enough to stand when the world tells you to bow. Remember that. It just needs a spine strong enough to stand when the world tells you to bow.
Remember that. It just needs a spine strong enough to stand when the world tells you to bow.